Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I always feel like it's a great panel and a great webinar that we're doing when I'm the least important person on it. CCF, Coalition for Civil Freedoms, is an organization set up in 2010 to support prisoners who are targeted as part of the U.S. war on terrorism. And it would particular focus on individuals that were targeted with sting operations. So we put together this webinar for you today. Before we jump into the topic of the Holy Land Foundation 5, I just want to briefly ask you to consider, if you're watching us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have a $5 a month subscription that is considerably cheaper than Netflix, and Netflix is awful. So, moving on, why are we here? So last October, the world was confused, if not wholly outraged, that the Israeli government criminalized 6 human rights organizations as terrorists. Al-Haq, Adamir, the Bisan Center, the Defense of Children International in Palestine, the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. All 6 of these organizations have spent years working closely with the rest of the world, with governments and with NGOs and with their counterparts in other countries to defend human rights and to advocate for the rule of law, only to end up in October on a list of so-called terrorist organizations as declared by the Israeli military. And this sparked unified international outrage, and it essentially discredited any remaining credibility for the Israeli government's terrorism accusations. But what this panel is about is that these claims really aren't new. Today, we're here to talk about the Holy Land Foundation case, the seizure of millions of dollars in assets that were for charity in Palestine, as well as for other communities, including victims of violent attacks and natural disasters here in the United States, as well as the subsequent prosecution of 5 charitable Muslim Palestinian American men here in U.S. courts based on the same kinds of accusations that were made last October against these 6 human rights organizations in Palestine. So we'll explore the similarities between the 2 cases and the general pattern of the US and Israel criminalizing basic forms of solidarity with other people as quote unquote terrorism. In a letter to the Biden administration, spearheaded by CCF and joined by dozens of other human rights advocacy groups, including Human Rights Watch, we stated, we, undersigned US and international civil and human rights organizations and individuals, call on the Biden administration to pardon the Holy Land Foundation 5. Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan El-Ashi, Mufid Abdul Qadir, Abdul Rahman Adeh, and Mohammed El-Mazain are prominent Palestinian American philanthropists who once ran the largest Muslim charity in the United States. The Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development was shut down by the Bush administration and designated as a terrorist organization in the wake of 9/11, even though it donated money to the Palestinian charities that the US government itself supported. The Holy Land prosecution was clouded by the fear and suspicion of Muslims in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But the Israeli military's decision to outlaw Palestinian human rights groups as quote-unquote terrorists indicates that then and now, these are politically motivated accusations, and US citizens do not belong in prison as a result. President Biden pardoned the Holy Land 5. Now you can see the entire letter, our extensive citations and background information, and all the different signatories, as well as sign your own name or your own organization's a name on the link that was included with the invitation for this panel. We've included a lot of background documentation about the case itself and about the general pattern, as well as the outrage internationally about the more recent decision by the Israeli military to designate the 6. Before introducing our panelists, I want to thank all of our signatories for our letter. I can't name all the individuals, but as far as organizations, in addition to the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, we'd like to thank Human Rights Watch, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the National Lawyers Guild, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, CAGE, the ICNAC Council for Social Justice, the International Action Center, Project South, the Afia Foundation, the Project at the CUNY School of Law, the Friends of Human Rights, Hamidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, the Palestinian Youth Movement, Muslim Justice League, the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, Palestine Legal, Al-Auda, the Palestine Right of Return Coalition, the Harriet Tubman Center for Social Justice, the Long Beach Area Peace Network, the National Lawyers Guild at CUNY School of Law, Human Rights Awareness Palestine Israel, Soy del Pueblo TV, the Libyan American Alliance, the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition, and the Islamic Resource Center, Jewish Voice for Peace Boston, Jewish Voice for Peace Los Angeles, the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, Within Our Lifetime United for Palestine, Students for Justice in Palestine at CUNY Law, the South Asian Law Students Association at CUNY Law, the Jewish Law Students Association at CUNY Law, Labor for Palestine, the Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, and the Charity and Security Network. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Miko Peled. He's the author of Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Five, a comprehensive and personal account of the Holy Land Foundation case, and The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. He blogs at mikopeled.com. Asma Elashi is the daughter of Ghassan Elashi, one of the co-founders of the Holy Land Foundation, who is now serving a 65-year sentence for the charges that are at issue in this panel. And finally, we have Omar Shakir, who is the Israel-Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, a role he was serving when the Israeli government deported him for his longstanding support for human rights. Prior to that, he investigated human rights abuses in Egypt, including the Raba massacre. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, Miko.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you. It's always good to be with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. You guys do incredible work, and I always appreciate being part of the things you do. I want to start with the end, perhaps, and what I mean by that is, as we talk about the horrible injustice that was done to the Holy Land Foundation and to the Five and their families and the entire Muslim American community as a result, I think we are in a position today to force a conversation on redefining terrorism altogether. The backdrop for accusing the Holy Land Foundation and the five fine gentlemen that are now that ended up in federal prison is that they were somehow aiding Palestinian resistance groups. It wasn't true, but that was the claim. Now that the amnesty report has been on Palestine and the apartheid regime has been released, it makes it absolutely clear that anyone standing in resistance to Israel, any Palestinian standing in resistance to Israel, is actually standing in resistance to a crime against humanity being perpetrated against the Palestinians. So it cannot possibly be terrorism. Now, granted, the State Department and and other governments have distanced themselves from the report and don't want to talk about it, don't want to accept it, and so on. But the fact remains that the report is out there, and the facts are indisputable. And it is a thorough report. If anyone hasn't read it, they should. If they've read it, they need to make copies and give their friends and send it to everybody they know, their churches, their clubs, their synagogues, anywhere they go, because people need to read this and then disseminate this and then demand answers. But again, going back to this issue, a Holy Land Foundation was charged with material support for terrorism. Well, resisting Israel is not terrorism. It cannot possibly be terrorism. I mean, I never thought it was to begin with, but now we have a report that states very clearly that Israel has been perpetrating a crime against humanity against the Palestinian people since 1948. No one standing up against it can possibly be accused of terrorism. It is a completely justifiable resistance against a crime being perpetrated against Palestinians. And there's something here that is incredibly important, which is that the State of Israel was established in 1948, and according to the report, the crime of apartheid has began exactly at that time. In other words, just a few years after World War II and the Holocaust, a few years after the crime against humanity was entered into international law during the Nuremberg trials, a state was established in Palestine that began perpetrating this crime against humanity against the Palestinians. And, all these years later, 3 of the 5, not all 5 are sitting in prison anymore. 3 of the 5 are still in serving long prison sentences for a crime that doesn't exist. Now, again, granted, they never committed any crime anyway. They didn't do any of the things that they were accused of doing. But regardless, they were convicted of this, and they were convicted of a crime that does not exist. So I think it's really, really important to put that. And I think this report that we have now, it gives us a really, really good tool with which to combat these allegations of terrorism, especially when we're talking about people that are somehow they're Palestinians, and this relates to Israel. Now, in terms of the actual story of the Holy Land Foundation, it's a story that is so absurd and so horrifying that I remember when I heard it first, I didn't believe it. It was in 2012, right after my first book, The General Sun, came out, and I couldn't believe it. And then as I was talking to other people about it, they couldn't believe it either. Nobody could believe that such a terrible injustice was possible in the United States, that the United States judicial system could be so corrupt, that could be so skewed against people who are not only innocent, they were fine people. There were people who dedicated their lives to doing very important work to help others in the most honest and sincere way. And then I found, after the book came out, after Injustice, and by the way, the book was a lot of work because it involved 5 different people and stories that had to come from all over the place, from the United States, from Palestine, other places. So there's a lot of and of course, visiting them in prison. But after the book came out and I began speaking about it, I realized something very interesting about America, which is the only people who are actually surprised by what happened, the only people who are shocked by what happened are people of privilege, people who are not subjected to the injustices of the American judicial system. Minorities, people of color, have suffered this for a very long time. So to them, there was no surprise here. To them, this was a continuation of an injustice that has been going on since, for centuries. For white people, or for lack of a better word, for privileged people, this was a shock. How could the American judicial system possibly act in such a way? Well, it's been acting in this way for a very, very long time. And so these freedoms that we take for granted as people of privilege do not exist and never actually existed to people of color and other minorities here within the United States. So that was an interesting lesson for me. But I felt very strongly that it was an important story to tell and a book to write, precisely because nobody could believe it happened. Now, my goal in writing the book was not for people to listen to me and believe what I had to say. In other words, I didn't want this to be my opinion. And so I spent a lot of time with, speaking with the Holy Land Foundation 5. Now, I was able to visit 4 of them. The only one I was not permitted to visit was Ghassan Ilashi, Asma's dad. And so all of our communication was done by email. Why I was not permitted to visit him, I don't know. I requested several times as he was moved around from prison to prison. The other ones I was permitted to visit, and him, for reasons that are never explained, I was not able to visit. But I wanted the story to come from them, from the families, and from the legal facts. In other words, what exactly transpired, what exactly took place, and also to give people a kind of a window into what took place in the courtroom, because what happened in the courtroom during the first and second trial was, again, anybody who has a sense that there's some kind of a judicial system that is just and fair needs to know what takes place in a courtroom in America when the people accused are Palestinians, Muslims, when their family members, their female family members are covered, they wear hijab, and there's this whole prejudice that comes in. And the prejudice was beyond obvious. It was not even, no one was even trying to hide the prejudice against them. From the prosecutor to the judge to the witnesses, there was not even an attempt to pretend that this is somehow not a circus. There were witnesses there, great important people who were, terrorism experts, PhDs who work in think tanks here in Washington, D.C., who talked about how it's obvious that by helping orphans, for example, Holy Land Foundation encouraged terrorism. By helping orphans, by having a program for orphans, which they had, they are clearly encouraging, not just supporting, encouraging terrorism. And how so? Well, if a parent knows that upon their death, their children will get a $50 a month stipend, certainly they will jump at the opportunity to become a terrorist. That was the logic. That was the kind of logic expressed. These were the kinds of arguments expressed in the trial by PhDs, by people who sit in think tanks and advise the president and advise God knows who in Washington, D.C. It was that level of absurdity. And on the other hand, when you had stellar witnesses like the former Consul General in Jerusalem, US Consul General in Jerusalem, explaining very clearly that the work that Holy Land Foundation did was important, was good, was sincere, that there was never any directive by anyone saying that not to work, that they should not be allowed to work with them, that they worked very well with other relief organizations. That was somehow, passed on. The fact that one of the accusations was that not perhaps they didn't support terrorism, but they worked with groups in Palestine that they support terrorism. So in other words, the relief organizations, the local relief organizations in Palestine, to which Holy Land Foundation gave money, they were the ones who were connected to terrorism. They were the ones who were connected to Hamas. And it was shown very clearly, again, from the testimony of the former US Consul General in Jerusalem, and by the witnesses themselves as they were being cross-examined, that there was absolutely no reason to assume that any of these organizations had anything to do with terrorism or with any particular organization that is associated with terrorism in Palestine. And when I first read about the case and started, hearing the stories, I thought, well, this seems like a pretty simple case. How is it possible that serious lawyers who are really dedicated to defending these people failed? How is it possible that they did not get acquittals? And when you read the transcripts of the trials, and I put as much of them in the book as I possibly could, so people will see. You see that they were absolutely, there was no consideration given to their arguments. There was nothing that they could have done in that courtroom, and there was nothing that they didn't try, because they tried. These were stellar lawyers. These were veterans. These were veteran lawyers, people who have a great deal of experience. Who would have done anything for these guys. The first time I interviewed John Boyd, who was one of the attorneys, he said to me, I would cut my right hand off if I thought it would release them. And the passion, with which they all spoke, because all the lawyers I spoke to spoke about these men, was so clear. They tried and they tried and they did everything. And the judges, both in the first and the second trial, ignored the evidence, did not listen to anything that the defense had to say. And it was clear that this was a trial that had to end in convictions. Now, it's interesting, I after the book came out, I did an interview with, many people, but Ralph Nader spoke to me about it a couple of times. And he said to me, it looks like the second judge was what they call a hanging judge. In other words, a judge that no matter what you show him, no matter what happens, he's going to convict. And that's precisely what happens. Now, again, I didn't want this to be an opinion. So I put as much of the transcripts of the trials in the book. So people can read for themselves the things that go on, the things that were said, and the way that the judge ignored the evidence, ignored the claims, ignored the demands of the defense. And then one of the stories that is, I mean, all the stories are horrible, but one of them, in the case of Mufid Abdul Qadir, he was found not guilty of all charges after the first trial. In the first trial, they had 32 charges. They were charged with 32 offenses. And I heard this from actually his wife, who was there taking notes. And she said they called not guilty 32 times. He is now at the very last part of, but still after, almost, 15 years into a 20-year sentence in federal prison. Because at the last minute, when the prosecution decided to poll the jury, one of the jurors stood up and said, "Oh, actually, no, I made a mistake. I changed my mind." And regardless of how hard the defense attorneys objected, the judge very quickly called a mistrial on him as well. So instead of being sent home free, there was a mistrial and he had to be tried again. And of course, the second trial, there was no way anybody was going home. And so this fine human being whose only crime was that he dedicated large parts of his life to charity, to raising money for causes that were being ignored. In other words, the causes for which Holy Land Foundation raised money were causes that were the need for their work should not have been there to begin with. And maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. But he served. Mufid Abdul Qadir is finishing a 20-year prison sentence after having been found not guilty in the first trial on all charges. Now, again, like I said earlier, none of them were guilty of anything, of any wrongdoing. If there was anything that any of these guys are guilty of, is being the kindest, most generous, most giving men, certainly some of the finest people I've ever met. And maybe and I will touch on this issue of the need. The work that Holy Land Foundation did as a relief organization went to help Palestinians, not only but mostly. Well, Palestinians are occupied by another country that should take care of their needs, even if they don't give them political rights, even if they deny them rights as a people. Why do Palestinian needs relief? They work hard, they're educated people. Why do they need relief? They only need relief because they're placed in a position where the authority that is charged with caring for them as human beings neglects to do so. And so there's a need for charity. And also as immediately when Holy Land Foundation was closed down, there is a UN report that shows clearly how there was you could tell that there was this vacuum, there was this gap in fulfilling some of the needs of the populations they took care of, particularly in Gaza. And so again, we're talking about a story that is so horrifying that is really unbelievable for people, for those of us who are people of privilege and are not usually accustomed to discrimination. We're not accustomed to a judicial system that discriminates against us. Anything that can be done should be done to help them, to get them released, because this is a terrible injustice. And I think it would be, granted, the first two, Abdurrahman Ode is released. Thankfully, he's home. And of course, he has to live with all the limitations that are placed upon people who are, felons who are released, convicted felons. Hamd al-Mazain was supposed to be released also. They both got 15 years, but instead of being released home, he was released to ICE. And now he's as far as I know, he's still in a cell, detained by ICE, in an ICE detention. And they're talking about deporting him. A man who dedicated his life, and his family lives here, dedicated his life to doing good things, living in this country. And Mufid Abdul Qadir will be released, hopefully, soon, when is almost just short of 20 years. And we still have Ghassan, Elashi, and Shukri Abu Bakr, who received 65 years. And when I went to Palestine, when I started working on the book, I visited Palestine several times to talk with people who worked and knew them. And I was surprised because many of the people didn't know about the 65-year sentence. They thought I got the numbers wrong. They thought I didn't speak the language. They thought they didn't hear me well. They could not believe the number 65 years. As well, they shouldn't have believed because it's an absurd sentence. But we have to do everything we can to get these guys out of jail and back to their families and back to their communities, and be properly compensated for the suffering that they had to endure.
Thank you, Nico, for your comments. I really appreciate it. And I think now we're going to go to Asma Elashi, if she is ready. Asma Elashi, as I mentioned, is the daughter of Ghassan Elashi. Asma, take it away.
Yeah, okay, so my name is Asma. Yeah, I'm the daughter of Ghassan. Like you mentioned, he was a co-founder. So like Miko was saying, him and Shukri Abu Bakr have 65 years. I just want to go back to, since his anniversary of his prison sentence is actually next month, I want to go back to April 2006. That was the year that he had already undergone another trial. Post 9/11, they were cracking down on all the Muslims because we were all being scapegoated. And he had a previous trial before the HLF. So don't want to confuse everyone, but basically he was sentenced to like 5 or 6 years in prison. And this was before his HLF sentence. And so he was the only one from the defendants that was actually serving, that was in jail while the trial was going on. So in April 2006, we were driving to the court basically so that he can, I guess, turn himself in, or I don't know what they call it, but give himself in so that he could start his prison sentence. And although I could remember it so clearly, even though it was such a long time ago, and I was only I was in my early teens, like 15 or something. And like a part of me, even though it was so much anguish, the feeling of, saying that goodbye, and you don't know if it's going to be your last goodbye. Like, I think it was a part of me that, because I was young, that had like a hope that he was just going to be a few years and he was going to be a free man again with his family. And now forward to next month, April 2022. And he's still, isolated in prison, long 16 years for essentially doing philanthropic work. So it is very disheartening because every year that goes by, you think, something is going to change. And we have exhausted all legal, attempts. And so I'm really grateful now that there's a shift in the whole, issue of Israel and Palestine. And it's becoming like a human rights issue, not just Palestine and Israel, isolated as always. So I just want to kind of go back to just kind of talk about my father a little bit, because, when you say HLF 5, it's kind of abstract, just 5 men. I just kind of want to put a human. So he was actually born in Gaza, and he was born to a Palestinian refugee. My grandma was in Jaffa, and in 1948, she basically got kicked out of her house to accommodate Israeli settlers. So she fled to Gaza, and that was when my dad, rest of my uncles, my aunt was born and raised. And he was in boarding school all his childhood. So he had a pretty challenging childhood. And he had finished his high school in Egypt and then went to Britain to study English, and then eventually made his way to America, where he was doing his master's degree in Florida. So he when he got married, I always tell the story, and my mom mentions it so many times, that when my dad got married to my mom and brought her from Jordan to America, on the plane he had told her, like, we're going to America, where there's freedom of religion, freedom of rights, we don't have to be restricted, we can do, what we want, and practice our religion freely, and there won't be so many restrictions like back home. And the irony of it was that after 9/11, like, that all changed. And even before 9/11, but it was so, I guess, explicit, after 9/11, like, there was no limits of what they can do. So yeah, after, the irony of it is that he has such a challenging childhood, and being refugee and seeing the hardships of Palestinians when he, living as a Palestinian, and when he came here and tried to do this work, and he was even a volunteer. He wasn't even, taking any cent from HLF, that he would be eventually, tried and sentenced to an outrageous 65 years. I would just want to, like, maybe talk about, because it's been so long since I've seen him. Because of COVID, they limited the visitations, or like they basically closed it. So the last time I actually saw him was like a week before the shutdown, COVID shutdown. So it was March 2020, and my daughter was 2 years old. And then, like, the week after we came back, everything was shut down, and we haven't seen him since. Like Miko mentioned, he's been to prisons all around the US. And I think the toughest part of being absent for these years, even though I had a beautiful childhood, I'm very thankful for that. My dad was the type he was very present. It's not like he worked long hours or anything. He had flexible work hours, always, brought us together through the meals he made, and through, whether we went on road trips or whatever. I had a very beautiful childhood, unlike my brothers, who were only in elementary school when my dad was in prison. Um, so throughout the years, basically, there were so many milestones that he missed, because of these critical years. And now that I'm a mother, I think the most disheartening thing was just not being able to, form a relationship between my father and my children. So his grandchildren. So he met my daughter, which was 2 when he last saw her, and I was pregnant with my second. Now my son, my second child, my son, is about to be 2, and he's never met him. So I can only show him pictures, or like send him pictures via mail. But other than that, like, he's never seen him. And so I think the most traumatizing and disturbing time was when my dad, for about 5 years, was in a prison called CMU, Communication Management Unit, in Illinois. And this prison is essentially a little prison inside of a bigger prison. So it's like a little Guantanamo, and there's probably like 40 inmates, and high profile cases, most of them Muslims, bogus terrorism charges, like, this is post 9/11. And he had spent 4 or 5 years there, and we would travel hundreds of miles, get to him, to only go into a small room, with all of us 6 family members, and we would have to visit him behind plexiglass. So no touching, no hugging, after not seeing him for over a year. because we would try to see him once a year, and we would do all our communication through a phone, looking at him behind a glass, and we can only talk through that phone, which is being live monitored in Washington. So it's very humiliating. um it just makes you not want to even be there, even though this is the only thing that's keeping him going, is seeing us. And then another thing that I wanted to mention was the cruel and unusual punishment that was being inflicted on my dad, even in the prison system. So um he many times was being basically targeted, and I guess some guards had some personal vendettas against him. For example, they wanted to strip search him after a visit, and he would give him like an attitude. Okay, they would just cancel the visitation, or they would like watch him like a hawk so that they can terminate the visit at any moment if something that we did was not right. Like we bought the food and we didn't put it on a plate instead of, just these stupid prison rules. So that was like kind of an emotional, like um I guess a roller coaster, and also just kind of uh disturbs and ruins your like emotional well-being, especially when you're just trying to make that connection, and see your father. So and then now he's in, so forward to where he is currently, he's in Kentucky. And when we were able to visit him pre-COVID, he was we could visit him, but we can only like hug him in the beginning and in the end of the visit. Um, and we can only visit him in, like, there's a yellow tape that forms a square, and you can only stand inside that square and hug him in the beginning and in the end of the visit. And then during the visit, you're sitting across from him, pretty far, and a table separating you guys, separating me and him. And then my daughter couldn't hug him, couldn't touch him. He can't have her on his lap, can't kiss her, anything. So it just feels very cold and distant. But yeah, I'm thankful that I, get to see him physically, because the behind the glass, that was just a whole level of torture. So just wanted to give you guys like just a kind of a life and the daughter of HLF5 prisoner, and how if you talk to the other daughters or sons, you're going to hear similar stories. How we get all the way to the prison and they do a drug test with a faulty machine, and they make it hypersensitive when we arrive, and then we all get tested positive and we can't visit him. So we have to like travel back after we had already bought the ticket and bought the hotel, and it's like you spent thousands of dollars. So you'll hear like the multiple stories that kind of give you PTSD, make your stomach hurt, and really like make you, like, I guess the same tactics that the Israelis use, that when you go and you visit Palestine and they question you for hours and they make you like not want to go back. That's what happens. Like they inflict these little I guess actions to make you not want to come back and visit him, because they know that that's the only thing that's keeping him going mentally. Um so so yeah, I mean, that's basically, I don't know if you had any questions, but
Well, Asma. So I'm curious. When before this ordeal, could you tell us more about when your father's work with the Holy Land Foundation, and what it might have been like for you and growing up, working with and being exposed to it?
yeah. So my older sister has some more of a memory of it. I definitely do, because I was around like 15 years old when um, this all went down, or a little bit younger. I do remember just being at the Holy Land Foundation office, and my sister and like the other older, teenagers were making calls to collect donations. So we would all work together. And it was, I kind of had like a very proud feeling like that my dad was doing this work. And it was very exciting to be proud of it, to be a part of it. And my dad would sit us down and let us watch documentaries and talk about the history of Palestine. So we were very, cultured to the whole situation. And we were also like, whenever they would bring kids from Palestine, for example, burn victims or kids that needed special treatments, and they would bring them to America, bring them here to receive treatments. That was very eye-opening because it was surreal. It's like, okay, you're doing this work in America and you're just sending the clothes and the money and the donations so that they can get food and medicine and all this stuff. But then when you actually see it firsthand, like this is what the donations are doing. This is how it's affecting the people in order for them to get treatments, for example, and seeing it firsthand, that was, it was surreal, and it made me like proud that they're impacting, people's lives like that. So.
Thank you so much, Asma. I think now we're going to transition to Omar. And as I mentioned, Omar Shakir is the Palestine-Israel Director at Human Rights Watch. Take it away, Omar.
Thanks so much, Amit. It's so moving to hear Asma speak. I mean, and so it's I'm sort of at a loss for words. And yeah, I mean, as a human rights lawyer for many years, just on a personal note, I have to say that the arrest, I still recall the arrest of the Holy Land Five, and that was one of those moments growing up that made me want to dedicate my life to human rights, was kind of the injustice of that case. So it's really an honor to be here speaking about this event, and really thanks to Amit and Lina and those at CCF for keeping this case in focus. It's so easy for us to sort of get caught up in the events of today and forget about people who have spent years, in detention for doing humanitarian work. It's important to kind of recall those people because they've spent every day, every week, every month, every year, while we've all gone about our lives, continuing to suffer from this injustice. What I want to do in my remarks is to sort of form a little bit of a bridge to the case of the six, the Palestinian civil society organizations that have been effectively outlawed by the Israeli government, and to kind of maybe reflect a little bit in the end of my remarks regarding what we can sort of draw from these experiences, and look forward to really engaging in the conversation. So for those that may be less familiar about what's happening in Israel, Palestine with regards to the six, let me just say a word about the facts, and then maybe we can take a step back. So in October, the Israeli government designated six of Palestine's most prominent civil society organizations as terrorist organizations. Amit listed their names in the outset. 2 weeks later, the Israeli army passed a similar regulation that applicable in the occupied West Bank that effectively outlawed the organizations. Basically, what these orders set out to do is that they authorized shutting down the offices of these organizations. They authorized seizing their assets, arresting and jailing their staff members, as well as anyone who expresses support, for the organization and funds the organization. So they're incredibly draconian laws that the Israeli government has been using, let's be clear, for years, for decades, but is now applying to, incredibly well-established organizations. Just to give you perspective, one of those six organizations is Al-Haq. Al-Haq is a human rights organization that's been around for more than 40 years. They do incredibly important work on a range of issues, from documenting human rights abuses in the West Bank, having to do with settlements, abuses even by the Palestinian Authority, women and gender issues. They are a close partner of Human Rights Watch. Their executive director serves on our advisory board. The group includes Adlamir. Adlamir is one of the prominent Palestinian prisoners' rights organization that does incredible advocacy on the rights of Palestinian prisoners. The groups include, organizations that work on children's rights, that work with agricultural workers, that work with women, that do research in the Palestinian academic scene. So we're not talking about a case of, the Israeli government going after tangential organizations. We're talking about them going after not only the heart of Palestinian civil society, but these are some of the organizations that were models of global South human rights organizing, that we're doing that we're not only following all the standards of the international community sets for the law, for etc., but we're also organizations that were engaging with UN mechanisms, UN systems, etc. When this happened, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty came together. We issued a joint statement saying this was an attack, on the human rights movement. This is attacking the very work that we do, and that this was an existential threat to Palestinian civil society. But I want to be clear that what happened to the 6 was not an isolated event. It is part of the Israeli government's sustained assault on human rights advocacy, right? It does not only apply to Palestinians have borne the brunt of this repression, and I'll get back to them in a minute, but it's affected others. International human rights advocates have been denied entry into Israel-Palestine. In fact, many Palestinians and Arabs, but human rights defenders, representatives of the UN, Amnesty International. Amit mentioned at the outset that the Israeli government deported me on a claim that we support boycotts of Israel. So they have a law that essentially imposes a political litmus test, and they even applied it to an organization, Human Rights Watch, that takes no position on boycotts of Israel or any other country. They have maligned and attacked Israeli human rights defenders and civil society organizations. They have restricted access to their funding. And of course, Palestinians have borne the brunt of that repression. Palestinian human rights defenders have faced travel bans. They have faced arrest and criminal charges, raids of offices. And so this criminalization is part of that larger picture. When the Israeli government deported me in November 2019, and that was after years and years of legal battles to get us Human Rights Watch access on the ground and then allow us to continue our work, we warned that this was setting a precedent that could lead to the criminalization fully of domestic civil society. And here we are in 2022, and that's the world that we live in. And it's important to note that this is a result of the international community failing to impose consequences on the Israeli government for their systematic violations of international law and human rights, and for their attacks on human rights defenders. So getting back to sort of the topic of this event, what's striking about what happened, again, to these organizations is the use of terrorism allegations in a context in which there was, simply put, no evidence, of this sort of activity. Here we are, almost, we're approaching 6 months after the designations were reached, and there has been no evidence put forward that links these organizations to terrorism. And this is not being just said by Human Rights Watch. You can quote governments, big European governments that have had access to the evidence that the Israeli government has made secret and not even provided to the organizations. And even these governments are saying there's nothing there. It's clearly part of a larger effort to muzzle human rights reporting. And again, it goes to the point of the linkages between these two cases. One point that is often forgotten about the Holy Land case, and again, Miko and Esma and others will tell you many more of the details. The beginnings, of the prosecutions, or even the looking into Holy Land began because the Israeli government took action against somebody involved with the Holy Land Foundation in the 90s. And again, correct me, those who know the cases more, but it again shows you the ways in which the kind of tools and methodologies of repression have gone back and forth between the United States and Israel. But I think the bigger point to make here, and I'm again working back to the Holy Land case, is the way in which the Israeli government and increasingly its allies, the United States being at the forefront, have criminalized any form of speaking out against the Israeli government's repression. Okay, so let's go through this pretty systematically, right? When Palestinians engage in violence, that is condemned as terrorism, right? Never mind the fact that we're seeing in Ukraine today, of course, armed resistance being hailed, being encouraged in all corners of the world. We're not comparing two factual situations, but legally you have an occupying force and you have people resisting that. Different standards. Okay, so let's say we're going to put violence aside. Let's go to the next level. When Palestinians demonstrate, let's take the March of Return in Gaza that took place in 2018 and 2019. The Israeli government gunned them down. We studied, this issue very closely. We documented the killings. The UN put together a commission of inquiry. These were people gunned down, for demonstrating, the overwhelming majority of whom, had no weapon, posed no threat. These are people subject to orders that were, these were not sort of, forces that used excessive force. These are people gunned down, subject to military orders that green-lighted that killing. So Palestinians, violent, that's terrorism, people are, assassination, all the tools that are used, right? Arrest, etc. And demonstrate, people are gunned down, right? Okay, so maybe people don't even demonstrate or people don't use violence. They boycott. Boycotts are an accepted form around the world of civil society action to end complicity in serious abuses. They've been used to fight injustice from the Montgomery bus boycotts in the US civil rights movement to apartheid South Africa today with Russia and Ukraine. Boycotts have been attacked systematically. 2011, Israel passes a law that says you can sue somebody. It's a civil action for calling for a boycott if you sustain damages. 2017, they amend their laws to order their interior ministry to deny entry to people who call for boycotts, of Israel. They then deport 2 years later a member of Human Rights Watch who takes no position on boycotts. And now you see even investigations of residents for breach of loyalty, Jerusalem residents, Palestinians who live there, citizens who boycott activities are leading to their being under the microscope. Okay, and then it's not just unique to the Israeli context. In the United States, 32 states, the majority of US states, have taken action that penalizes individuals who call for boycotts and companies who boycott, right? This could be being listed on a blacklist. This could mean states not doing business with you, including individual contractors, people who decide, hey, I don't want to have to sign a contract if I'm a teacher at a school, that in order to get my salary, I have to sign a pledge that I won't boycott Israel. And it's also penalizing companies that are acting in line with their human rights responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles. UN Guiding Principles say do not benefit from or contribute to human rights abuse. Human Rights Watch and dozens of other human rights organizations have said if you work in Israeli settlements, you're complicit in serious rights abuse. So, stop that if you want to meet your human rights duties. Companies who have done that have found themselves penalized by US states. So you can't boycott. And again, it's not just this past month in the UK. There have been measures taken to also restrict BDS. Germany passed a resolution that equated boycotts with anti-Semitism. And Austria and Vienna, we have a case right now in the courts where BDS activists are being sued by the municipality for their posters. Okay, so we have violence, okay, not allowed. Demonstrating, you can get gunned down. in the Israeli-Palestinian context. You boycott, you could be denied entry, you could be sued, you could be penalized, you can lose your job, you can lose your work. Okay, all that, and we're not even talking about these outrageous cases, right? So what are we talking about here? In the case of the Holy Land Foundation, we're talking about charity work, humanitarian work, giving money. And the insane thing, and again, this was highlighted by prior speakers, there was no argument made that they actually ever gave money that went to be used in violent attacks, or that these individuals intended that they be used for violent attacks. The argument was predicated on laws around material support for terrorism, right? These are these overly broad draconian laws that basically, allow people to be criminally charged, for things that are just humanitarian work. If there is some nexus, and again, the US Supreme Court has upheld an interpretation of material support in cases that could be providing legal support, that could be providing humanitarian aid, and you can lead to these results. So charity work. And again, I mean, when you hear Esma, it's just you reflect, these are Palestinians that were forced to flee their homes, that came to develop a new life, and that made money, were successful, and wanted to give back. This was the largest Muslim charity in the United States. And without proving any wrongdoing, these men were thrown in prison. They're torn away from their families, and their kids and grandkids are paying the cost today in 2022. And finally, in the case of Palestine, we're talking about human rights defenders. We're talking about people that document human rights abuse, people who apply international law, groups who petition UN bodies. I mean, that work is being called terrorism. So what option are you leaving Palestinians besides submission to apartheid, submission to your subjugation? And that's a question that's left unanswered. And it's not limited to the Israeli-Palestinian context. The tentacles are spreading, right? And it's not just affecting Palestinians, right? Like, Palestinians pay the brunt of the cost, but it's moving. And you have international organizations, you have Israelis, and the precedent being used, whether it's anti-boycott laws, whether it's going after human rights defenders, are spreading to many, many others. So just in concluding, right, I think we need to take a step back, right, and see where we are today. Not only have we not reckoned with these injustices, not only have we not paid amends and released these men for these prosecutions. Again, people say, well, it was 9/11, and you have to understand the context of the United States and the hysteria and whatever. But here we are, they still sit in prison today. President Biden, with a stroke of a pen, could pardon the men that may remain detained, but that's not happening. There are still 38 men detained in Guantanamo Bay, many of whom have never been charged with a crime. So not only have we not reckoned with these moments, not only have we not done that, but we haven't held the perpetrators accountable. Those that purveyed misinformation, that tortured, that put innocent people behind bars. But then today we're replicating this, and it's expanding and metastasizing. Al-Haq, which was operating in the 1980s, which was operating in the 1990s, in the 2000s, the 2010s, when the Holy Land 5 were being tried and put in prison, were operating today, suddenly are terrorist organizations. So I think it's incumbent, again, for all of us, and thank you to the people who have joined this call for raising these issues. But I think we need to speak out for those behind bars, not only because of the inherent justice of the cause, but because when we don't learn from the mistakes, when we don't hold perpetrators to account, we repeat those mistakes.
Thank you so much for that, Omar. Before we go any further, I do want to apologize. There's a slight audio delay. I definitely didn't mean to cut off any of our panelists. Unfortunately, Mr. Miko Peled had to leave. However, Luna has posted a link where you can purchase Miko Peled's book, and I encourage everyone who is interested in getting a more in-depth look at the issue to do that. We also have, I believe we're going to post it in the chat. We have the link to the actual letter that we have published, as well as an opportunity for anyone who's watching this who feels moved to sign on and join all of us in calling on President Biden to release the Holy Land Foundation. We are going to open it up to questions. I see that there are a few already. Asma, one audience member is asking, have you faced harassment from U.S. authorities such as the FBI or ICE as a result of this situation? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Okay, so the question, sorry, I'm looking at it. Have I faced harassment? While the trial was going on, or like in general? I haven't from like an FBI. My dad was actually very careful, and I guess so when the FBI came to not knock, just basically try to trample our door down and arrest my father the second time, because the first time he was actually on his way back from prayer in the morning. So they arrested him, stopped him in the car and then arrested him. So we never witnessed that. But then the second time, he did not open the door for them. He said behind the door, "Do you have a search warrant?" And they said no. So he said, "Okay, I'm not going to open the door." So we never saw them or except or spoke to them, except when my dad opened the door and they took him. And then just in general, throughout just post 9/11, yes, I've experienced discrimination, bluntly or not bluntly, just because I wear hijab and I'm Muslim, but very Islamophobic, I guess, even though I live in Dallas, but it's still the South in Texas. So, of course I'm bound to experience it, but not from any FBI in general, or specifically.
Thank you for that. We have another question, which is, I'm going to open it to both of you to weigh in, which is, how do you explain the cognitive dissonance and the double standards between the global North's reaction to Russia invading Ukraine with settler colonialism of those supporting the political nationalistic ideology of Zionism against Palestine?
Do you want to go first, or would you like me to?
No, you can do that one.
I think it's there. I think the answer to that question is beyond my competence as a, look, I'm a human rights defender. So I work for an organization whose mandate is the law. We apply the law. We work on 100 countries around the world, and we apply the same principles and same practices everywhere. So, the same body of laws, that lead us to call settlements war crimes and to call forcible transfer of Palestinians war crimes. It's the same body of laws that provide protections to Ukrainians in light of the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine. And so why is there a disconnect? That's a question that somebody whose frame of reference is the law can't answer for you, because the principles should be similar, right? That doesn't mean the facts are similar. There are different facts. You can debate, whether, how they look different in practice, but the law is similar. It's similar to the situation of, apartheid. When Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or B'Tselem say the Israeli government is committing apartheid, we aren't saying it's a carbon copy of South Africa. We are saying that the world determined that apartheid was such a grave evil that it created a crime called apartheid that was universal in scope and that others have committed. Similarly, it's the same principles of law. So when you see the disconnect, for example, on views about boycotts, where Russian companies are being boycotted in mass. And let me be clear, what the abuses taking place by the Russians are serious. This is not to say, what I'm here to say is not that, well, they shouldn't criticize Russia because they're not criticizing Israel. No, we're saying it's the same principles. So just as you criticize Russian rights abuse and repression in the Ukraine, you should call out the same things when it's committed by Israel in the Golan Heights or in the West Bank, or when it's committed by the Moroccans in Western Sahara. So, the inconsistency is geopolitical ultimately, right? And so, and what accounts for that? I mean, it's the different power politics. It's different. It's the different media narratives that are out there. It's the different understandings. It's powerful states that are backing complicity of the Israeli government. But those are all me saying those things is not a scientific study that I've done. It's me telling you that I can't explain it to you in legal and human rights terms. So you're going to have to look elsewhere for a explanation.
Would you like to weigh in on that one, or?
I was just going to say the same thing about the media narrative. Like, whenever Israel attacks Gaza, for example, like last year, it was, the titles were okay, rocket, the same old stuff. Like, that it was a response to rockets being launched. But it would be silly to say the same thing with the Ukraine and Russia, like Ukraine, did something and then Russia went and attacked it. No, I mean, at the end, there's, not a proportion of power, and it's obvious who the main oppressors are. And so, it's just all about how the media is portraying it and the narrative that they want people to adopt.
Thank you guys both for that. Several people are asking about the opportunity to sign the letter. I think Lena has posted it in the chat, so anyone who's interested in that can check it out. We have another question. Somebody's asked, can Mr. Shakir clarify Human Rights Watch's non-position on boycotts? Is this to maintain the ability to continue working in Israel-Palestine?
Well, it's clearly not that, because I got kicked out of the country, even though we don't take a position on boycott. So it's definitely not that answer. But no, I mean, look, it's a universal position, right? So to take a step back, Human Rights Watch documents, abuses in war, in even in non-war situations, human rights abuses. We don't take sides in armed conflict of particular parties. We document human rights abuses committed by all parties. We also, our main work is to call on duty bearers to adhere to their obligations, right? So we tell a country, don't abuse human rights. We tell a corporation, don't adhere to your responsibilities under the UN guiding principles. But we don't make calls to everyday people. So we don't say, go boycott company X. Our advocacy is to the company and to the country or to the non-state actor to adhere to their human rights responsibilities, right? So as a result, we don't take, we're directly making advocacy calls on states or on companies on how to respect human rights. Now, what consumers choose to do based on the information is their decision. That's why we say we don't take a position on it. We don't oppose or support. Our work is different than activism. So, for taking the example of the Israeli-Palestinian context, right? We call on businesses not to operate in settlements and not to contribute to the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, right? So we will tell the company to do that. Now, we're not going to say customer do X or Y because of that, right? So that's where the distinction is. And also, our advocacy is, company X don't do this in order to adhere to human rights responsibilities. Whereas boycott, BDS is saying, you boycott so that we can achieve these goals, right? Ending the occupation, etc. So boycott is a tool of pressure. Whereas for us, our advocacy is about calling on the company or the country to adhere to human rights practices. So when it comes to Israel-Palestine, we document the human rights abuse. We say, don't do do business with settlements or in settlements, but the call is to the company. So it's about that. It's not about a different standard for different places. It's the same position on anything, right? Like in other contexts.
Thank you for that. The next question is, Asma mentioned that all legal remedies have been exhausted. Is this because of limited funds to try to overturn the rulings? If not, what could be done to continue to fight this injustice?
So all legal, attempts have been exhausted because I don't think it was lack of funding. I think because we took it to the higher courts, the Supreme Courts, before appealing, and then we tried for a presidential pardon with Obama, and that nothing came out of that. Well, I don't know the exact details, but that didn't work, obviously. And then we tried to do a commutation of sentence, so basically to just lower the amount of years. And then we tried to work on a plan to just deport them, like to whatever country can accept, like Turkey or, and that didn't work. And so right now, I'm hoping the initiative we do right now could help, but that's what we've done so far with the legal attempts.
There's also a question about whether or not there's any attempt to get Biden to pardon the Holy Land Foundation. So if I wasn't clear, the letter that we're asking everyone to consider signing is exactly that we are asking President Biden to do exactly that and pardon all 5 of the members. I don't think we have any other additional questions. So I do want to mention though that there's a lot of very really beautiful comments from everyone as well, including Linda Moreno, who is one of the attorneys for Ghassan El-Ashi. And of course, thank you, Linda, for being here, and for anyone else who's attending this panel and being with us today that actually helped fight this case. Before we close, I want to give the last words to both of our panelists. So Omar, do you want to go first?
I just again thank everybody for being here, and just to recall, if you were moved by today's events or this conversation, just to sign the petition, to raise awareness about these cases. I think let's be clear, pardons are really, really, really difficult, and it's especially difficult when it's a case like this that not even mentioning anything else, but a case like this which was so in the media, and in which it's easy to caricature those being released in ways that are untruthful. So I think with the legal process being exhausted, it's really an example where sharing that letter, raising your voices, it's critically important, and to understand that it's not only about the families and their rights to reunite with their loved ones, but we're talking about the possibility of the perpetuation of this today. So right now we have a situation with the Sikhs in Palestine where they're outlawed, but their staff, their supporters are not yet all in prison. Some are, by the way, including just yesterday, or maybe the day before now, where a member of Al-Damir, one of the Sikhs, a lawyer for them, Salih Hamoudi, who, by the way, phone was hacked by Pegasus, who had previously served in detention without trial or charge, whose residency status is being revoked, was put back in administrative detention. So we're talking about a situation in which these things are continuing. So let's not only speak out for reuniting Esma with her father and allowing her father to meet his grandkids, but let's do it so that we don't reproduce this kind of violence for other human rights defenders and civil society advocates.
Exactly. Thank you, Ahmad, for that comment. And I totally agree that this will set a precedent, and hopefully if this is true, and that's why it's been so difficult, to basically acquit them, you know, my father and Shukri and the rest that are still in prison, because of they've simply, you know, used HLF as examples, not only in my community that caused a lot of fear and tension and division, but also like abroad. Now you're saying, so I'm sure that it's instilling a lot of fear and division also in Palestine, and that's always been their tactic. And so if we can, you know, free them, hopefully that can set a precedent, and it can, you know, widen, you know, to everyone, um, because we're not the first or the last. And like Ahmad was saying, history just keep repeating itself over and over.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all of our panelists, Omar, Asma, and Miko as well. And I want to thank all of you guys for attending. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. If you were moved by this panel and you haven't already signed, please consider doing that. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us.